Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Transparency and Accountability Fighting Corruption, a live program brought to you by Zim Papers Television Network ZTN in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe TIZ. I'm Blessing Munatsi. Today our discussion is headlined Corruption Risks During Disaster Response, Gaps and Opportunities in Managing Corruption Risks in the Distribution of Social Protection Initiatives and Humanitarian Aid in Zimbabwe, particularly, of course, during disaster response. I'm joined in studio by Alois Nyamazana, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Officer with Transparency International Zimbabwe. During the course of today's show, we will be talking to journalists Hope Ochingono, as well as Honorable Felix Mona, who is the chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Budget, Finance and Economic Development. Alois, thank you so much. It's good to have you once again.
Thank you so much, Blessing. Good afternoon, viewers.
Now, can you highlight some of the key findings from the TIZ research on humanitarian aid and some of the lessons that come out of that, especially in line with COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you so much, Blessing. Transparency International Zimbabwe conducted research last year and we concluded it early this year. And we found some very sad findings during the research. One of the key issues that we discovered as a corruption risk during humanitarian assistance is issues of politicization of aid. We noted that so many times there is the aid is hijacked by politicians who normally distribute aid based on political grounds. So those that are not perceived to be politically correct are normally sidelined. Yet if you look at a disaster, it affects everyone regardless of political affiliation. So that's one risk that we noted. We also found that during humanitarian assistance, there are issues around limited access to information, particularly around public procurement, where the citizens are not aware of how goods are being procured, who is benefiting, and what are the terms and conditions of the contract that are being signed between possibly the government and the suppliers of some equipment. We also know the issues around collusion, whereby a group of people would then come together and also come up with some ways of getting resources for their own benefit instead of the people or the communities benefiting. So in the end, issues around double registration of beneficiaries, issues of exclusion of other people, particularly people living with disabilities and the elderly people, were then excluded because those guys try to find ways of ensuring that they also get resources for themselves. We also noted that issues around sextortion, where sex was being used as a currency to pay or to bribe in order to get humanitarian assistance. So we all know that during the cyclone in there, for example, houses were swept away. People, they suffered quite a number of losses. So people were also desperate, and particularly women, because of their caring roles, they are then vulnerable to that sexual exploitation because they needed the help. So we also discovered that so many times during humanitarian crisis, there are also flouting of some regulations, ethical regulations regarding issues around ensuring that people get access to basic services. So in the end, what we noted is that we received adequate resources, we received adequate funds to cater for the needs of the people in Chimanimani, as well as possibly in where the cholera epidemic happened. But because of corruption, those people are still in a very sad state. Roads have not been rehabilitated, they don't have access to water, they don't have access to adequate accommodation, because the resources that were supposed to benefit them were then taken by some other few individuals in form of corruption. So in terms of the lessons for the COVID-19, we feel that there's need for a coordinated framework of ensuring that we deal out with some issues that are causing corruption during humanitarian assistance. So I think from the cyclone Idai, we were supposed, especially immediately after the cyclone Idai, we were supposed to do a review as a nation in terms of how we conducted ourselves, how we handled the resources, and also look at the corruption risks and gaps so that we can then deal with them. Right now in COVID-19, but it appears we do have to have a strategy to deal with corruption as a nation.
Some key highlights that you're pointing out there. Probably we will be highlighting some of the points that you did raise with our guests that we will be in touch with over the telephone, Hope Ochingono, as well as Honorable Felix Mona, to just shed more light on possibly the challenges that are involved maybe with this report. Now, this report, how recent was it?
The report is very recent. Like what I said, you started very late last year and you concluded it very this year, I think around February, March. We actually wanted to launch it, but because of the COVID-19, we couldn't. So we are then trying to publicize it through these platforms like this one. So it's a very recent report.
Now, the politicizing of aid, like you did mention, you obviously say it's a significant problem, but is it an impediment to relief efforts?
It is indeed a serious impediment because, like what I highlighted earlier on, you know, these humanitarian crises, they don't select people based on their political affiliations, regardless of whether you belong to Party A, Party B, or Party C. You know, the cyclone just affects everyone. So this really then, if there's corruption, it automatically means that as people are going to be selected along political grounds, obviously others are going to be sidelined. Those that do not have political currents, those that are not politically exposed will then suffer. And that then will then infringe on their human rights in terms of issues around human dignity. So, you know, we might have donors pouring out quite a number of resources for fighting this crisis. But if there's corruption, then obviously the efforts will be useless.
Right, this is corruption risks during disaster response, gaps and opportunities. That what we're looking at today. The program is Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a program brought to you by Zim Papers Television Network in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe. Now I'm joined on the line by Hopo Chingono, a journalist. Hopo, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, Alois was just highlighting here the importance of access to information coming out of their recent research as an impediment, of course, to issues of social protection. How has the media performed, especially in times of disaster and looking around information access and also intended beneficiaries actually having information on their rights and their entitlements?
Okay, you asked how has the media performed, is that correct?
That's correct.
How has it performed? I think what we have is structural weakness, not just in the media, but in the whole economy. So the media has not been able to actually highlight the deficiencies in the, for instance, how aid is distributed. A good example is we have seen planes coming from outside the country bringing COVID aid into Zimbabwe, but the media has not been able to tell us where this aid has been taken to, how it has been distributed, who has been distributing it, and who has received it. We have not been able to get that from the media. So that's a very strong weakness. But it stems from the incompetence that we see not just in the media, but across the board. We don't have competent institutions that are able to hold the government to account for the actions and for how it distributes aid, whether it's coming from outside the country or whether it's social protection that is coming from government resources.
Now, what are some of the risks likely to aid corruption tendencies during periods of disaster like the current COVID-19? And does government have that obligation to declare the aid and the assistance that's coming? Is it an obligation or rather discretionary?
Of course, it's an obligation because the government is elected by the people. It should report back to the people that this is what we have received on your behalf and this is how we are going to use it. And the problem that we have in Zimbabwe is that the ruling state or the ruling party runs a very patronage and partisan system, which is extremely corrupt and rotten to the core. So you find that if you go to Zishavani today, someone does not receive aid on the basis that they do not support the ruling party. I've been to so many places where I was filming during the COVID time where I get opposition supporters saying we've not been given, we've been told that we should go and get our aid from Nelson Chamisa. These things happen daily and they are recorded and we put them on social media.
Hopo, what needs to be done there? Because Alois highlighted that point. It came out as part of their research, the politicizing of aid. What needs to be done to close that gap and put an end to this?
Emerson Mnangagwa and his government simply need to implement their electoral promises. The president said that he was going to implement political reforms, because the basis of the coup that took place was that it was going to undo the road that supposedly had taken place under Robert Mugabe. But that has never been done. We've just continued as if nothing has changed. So they need to implement political reforms that can make the institutions strong. And when they hire people, they should hire them on account of their competencies, not on clansman basis or who do you know basis.
Now, let me take you to the point of Parliament oversight, its role. Is it effective in its mandate in improving accountability, especially of funds?
I think in a broader perspective, our Parliament is weak because we send parliamentarians, we send people to Parliament who are not conviction politicians. They are going there. It's like a job for them, you know. So sometimes when you send people who are not competent to Parliament, you should not expect competence to come out of that Parliament.
But this is you and me choosing these very people to represent us.
Exactly, but you and me do not have control over how they are elected at party level. There's partisanship because the system, the country has become so deeply corrupt. You find that people are imposed. That's why you find that an independent MP will go and win. It's because the citizens are rebelling against political parties. But the rebelling has not been enough to make a substantive dent into the system or to force the political parties, both ZANU-PF and MDC, to implement reforms that bring transparency in how they select these candidates and how they are sent to Parliament.
What can you say are the structural and policy gaps in Zimbabwe that actually promoted corruption to thrive to its current levels?
It's just that, you know, the ruling party just did not live up to. You see, the one thing that your viewers must understand is that Zimbabwe does not lack a constitution that can stop this. When we talk about political reforms, we are not talking about a new set of reforms that need to be implemented for corruption to go away. We are simply saying, Mr. Mnangagwa and your government, please follow the Constitution. That's what we mean by political reforms, because the rules and regulations and the laws are already there, but they are being violated. And this violation happens everywhere at every level. If you and I want to go and get a passport today, we have to stand in a queue. But someone will come and say, okay, if you give me an extra $100, you will jump the queue and I'll give you the passport. And when it gets to the top level, the top office, the president, it becomes bigger and broader. So
is this a problem? Is this a problem that is unique to Zimbabwe, Hopo? Because looking at the global corruption report for 2019, it says 1 in 4 people in Africa out of 35 nations, at least 25%, have paid for a bribe within the past year to access a service.
Yeah, I was looking at corruption indices a couple of months ago, and one thing that I found very interesting is that every country has a level of corruption. So in India, the level of corruption could be 1%. So if politicians steal 50 million, it will not have an impact on whether you and I or our grandparents at the village are able to access medication or not. But the corruption in Zimbabwe has become so rampant that you would find that 3 billion goes missing and no one is able to account for it. The Ministry of Finance comes to Parliament and says that, yes, the 3 billion went missing, but we can't account for it. That kind of corruption is crude, and it destroys and it kills people. That's why we end up closing our hospitals for 4 months, because the level of corruption has become so obscene. In South Africa, there's corruption, but you would never hear that 3 billion has gone missing. That economy is far much bigger than ours.
As a call for action, would repossession of ill-gotten wealth be an option, and how can we ensure effective lifestyle audits?
I think we need a reconstruction of the system, and I think what needs to be done, this is my view, what needs to be done is that we need, if it were to be done by the current system, of course, that is what they need to do. But if there is a new system that comes in place, in other words, if ZANU-PF is removed from office, because it has been running the state for 40 years and is accountable for all the corruption that took place in the past 40 years. If a new system comes, you draw a line. This is what I've seen that works in other countries. You draw a line and you say, what happened on this side happened on that side. But if it happens again on this other side, we have the right to arrest you and hold you accountable for what happened on the other side. So what it means is that people now have an incentive to live straight lives and not be corrupt anymore. You give them an incentive by saying to them, don't do it on this side. But if you do it on this side, you will be accountable for what you did on the other side. And the rule of law should simply be implemented. Police should be allowed to do their work. Judges and the judiciary should be not corrupted. Right now we have a captured judiciary in Zimbabwe. They rule and make some ridiculous judgments, but it's because we need to reconstruct the state and put the citizen at the center of the state. The state should serve the citizen, not the other way around.
Hopo, thank you so much for your candid contribution.
Thank you very much.
Hopo Chingono, a journalist, giving us his insights there. I may have to reiterate that the views expressed by our panelists remain theirs purely and not shared by the Zim Papers group. This is the program Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption. Alois, Hopo, they calling for action and seemingly saying that our institutions are not strong enough.
Yeah, I totally agree with him, because if you have strong institutions, obviously it's very easy to fight corruption. So like now we are talking about the corruption within humanitarian assistance. And I think we have institutions like ZAC, we have institutions like Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. I think they need to be on the ground to assess the situation and to help citizens where they need help. So to us, I think they are not properly capacitated to carry out their mandates as public institutions. And of course, like the judiciary should also play its role. Even the parliament itself should also play its role. So like in terms of the constitution, we have very good institutions on paper, but I think they should then go a step forward in terms of then implementing their mandates and ensuring that they are also protecting the rights of the citizens.
It's critical that you mentioned the strength of our constitution, because I was about to ask, what have we been doing right?
I think that question is it's a bit difficult, because one, we still, though, for example, last year we improved a bit, we've moved two steps in the positive direction in terms of the global, in the global corruption index, and that's a plus. We need to celebrate those gains. But I think, speaking broadly, I think we haven't been doing quite well in terms of fighting corruption. Because like right now,
if we have set up institutions, is it that these institutions are not carrying out their mandate full circle in terms of action? The assessment that I've done is that institutions, possibly one, they are incapacitated. Like, for example, the Human Rights Commission is only in Harare and Bulawayo, but in all these other parts of exactly. So it's too centralized. Same applies to ZEC. It's also only in Harare and Bulawayo, but Zimbabwe is not Harare and Bulawayo. Zimbabwe is 10 provinces. So you see that there's quite a number of challenges in terms of capacity of these commissions to also deliver. But also there's some other issues that are normally raised about issues around political capturing, being captured by some other powerful forces. I think we've had so many instances where the media and even some other government officials also saying our institutions are somehow captured. So that also even derail their capacity to then deliver on their mandates. So we need very independent institutions, that deliver their mandate without looking at what other people would then say. Still on the issue of policy gaps related to the management and distribution, of course, of humanitarian aid in Zimbabwe, are there any gaping holes that need to be filled?
There are gaps that need to be filled. Firstly, like what I said, I'll keep on referring to our research. One thing that we noted is that there's lack of a coordinated framework of how to deal with corruption, or even how to handle the goods and resources that are distributed towards humanitarian crisis. So you see that possibly government is doing something, NGOs are doing something, churches are doing something, companies are doing something. But there's that of a lack of coordinated framework on how do we then ensure that the aid that is coming from these different sources is reaching its intended beneficiaries. So where there's chaos, they're also it's a very good breeding ground for corruption, because everyone is doing something, but then there's lack of coordination. Then secondly, what we also notice is that the Civil Protection Act needs to be reviewed, because it was enacted in 1989 and we are now in 2020. So many things have changed. Now the focus is on citizen participation. But the Civil Protection Act is also quiet on issues around citizen participation. So we need to then re-look at our Civil Protection Act to see whether it's addressing the current contextual realities in dealing with emergencies and humanitarian issues.
Obviously, the role of the citizen remains critical in bringing corruption to the fore, because corruption does not occur in a vacuum, does it? But have we done enough to actually enable safe reporting of corruption, both in Zimbabwe and also in Africa?
I would say we haven't done quite well in terms of ensuring that people report corruption. Firstly, there's a culture of fear in our country. People are not very confident to hold their leaders or duty bearers to account. Possibly it's because of our political landscape. If you go, Zimbabwe is too polarized, a polarized nation, where sometimes even if you highlight a very critical issue, genuine issue about maybe the conduct of a certain political person or a duty bearer, people will then start labeling you as politically incorrect. So people are then not very free to then report corruption cases. We have done some studies, even when we are doing our researches at Transparency International, even when we are doing our evaluations, sometimes people are not very even free to talk about corruption itself because of possibly some other cross-structural barriers. So those are some of the issues that we then need to deal with. Then the other thing that's missing is the whistleblower protection mechanism. There is no policy of protecting those that report corruption. You have to appear in person to then, if you are a victim or a witness of corruption, you have maybe to appear in person before the courts and testify, and it's a very cumbersome process. And then it's a deterrent for people to reporting corruption, because people then fear being victimized, all those things. So I think we have quite a number of gaps in terms of an enabling environment for people to report corruption.
Would it be possible for someone to report corruption and not be a key witness? Just taking a look at the judicial system that we have, because one has then to testify in a court of law.
I think there should be, we can take some examples from other countries. I think some other countries, even like South Africa, in other countries across the region, even in Africa, they do have whistleblower protection mechanisms where a person can report a case, and then the responsible organizations can do their investigations, collect their evidence without exposing the reporting person. Because corruption, you should not forget the fact that corruption benefits some individuals. So when they find out that their source of income is now being exposed, they can do some very nasty things to the person that is reporting. So in other countries, they've managed to protect the whistleblower through doing their independent investigation, independently collecting evidence without exposing the reporter. So it's very possible, in my view.
The program is Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption. Today we're looking at corruption risks during disaster response, the gaps and also the opportunities. We spoke, of course, to Hope Wachingona over the telephone. We should also be talking to Honorable Felix Mona, who is the chairperson of the Budget Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Finance and Economy. We should be talking to him just after this breather. Don't go away. Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a program brought to you by Transparency International Zimbabwe in partnership with Zimpapers Television Network. Today we're looking at corruption risks during a disaster response, the gaps and also the opportunities. I have in studio Alois Nyamazana, who is the Monitoring and Evaluation Officer at Transparency International. Now, Alois, before we took that short breather, you did highlight the issue of the polarized nature of Zimbabwe's political landscape and the issue of trust. I just want you to comment maybe on the mutual trust being a barrier to the fight against corruption, now especially between government and also the civil society.
Thank you. Yeah, that aspect is a serious impediment towards in the fight against corruption, because civil society, there's that lack of linkages, collaborations between civil society and government. If you as you may be aware, civil society has done quite a number of researches. Civil society has done quite a number of interventions to fight corruption and also to promote transparency and accountability. But there's that lack of, I would say, buy-in or collaboration between the government and civil society, where sometimes I feel maybe because of our political, historical background, government may end up perceiving civil society as being politically incorrect or driving a certain political agenda. But that's not true. But our happiest here is that I would say recently we've been able to work well with ZAC, and we actually have a memorandum of understanding. And to us, this is a step in the right direction. So I think there's that need for collaborations between government and civil society. As long as there's lack of that collaboration, then we will not be able to then win the war against corruption.
Transparency and Accountability is the program. I am joined now on the line by Honorable Felix Mona, who is the chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Budget, Finance and also Economic Development. Honorable Mona, it's so good to have you.
Thank you very much, Blessing. How are you?
Fine, thanks. As the Parliamentary Committee on Budget and Finance, what are you doing to ensure that accountability of resources harnessed by government are actually disbursed?
Thank you very much, Blessing. I'm sure and also glad to say that as Parliament, we are mandated by the Supreme Constitution of Zimbabwe, and in particular Section 299, subsection 1 and 2, provides for oversight role of Parliament. So it means whatever is being expended by government, Parliament has to take government to account. Mm-hmm. And I think given the nature of our Parliament is enshrined in the Constitution, you find that it is very important, the issue of the doctrine of separation of powers. Mm-hmm. So in whatever the government does, whether there are donations, whether there are funds coming through, it is the mandate of Parliament to do the oversight. Mm-hmm. And in particular, my committee is responsible.
Have we been effective in this role of oversight? Because I was talking to Hope Wachingona just now over the phone, and he seems to be of the perception that, Parliament is being bypassed somehow.
You know what, Blessing, especially in the advent of any pandemic, at times, institutions are caught unawares. And in this particular instance, with special reference to the pandemic that we are seized with right now, you find that there might be some gaps that would come in. Not necessarily that one is being overlooked, but there are no mechanisms in place to address, because it will be the face of its own kind. Mm-hmm. So I think if you remember well, a week ago, Parliament had to reconvene so that they map a way forward is to address the roles of Parliament. And I'm glad to say my committee is one of the 6 committees that are actually meeting to address the issues of the legislatives, the oversight role, and we are in the process of trying to see what really transpired during the lockdown period and how the government was expending. And on that note, we have also written to the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. We'll be coming to the committee next week on Wednesday, and thereafter also have time to interrogate the Minister of Finance so that we do take him to task to say what is really happening and what really transpired during mm-hmm. the lockdown period. Mm-hmm.
Given the nature of the disaster, like you have highlighted, are we doing enough to maintain the checks and balances to the same strict guidelines in order to ensure that accountability is actually observed?
Blessing, we actually have got the necessary tools in our arsenal, and one of them is the Constitution. But what is actually of paramount importance is the implementation. And you find that at times Parliament is crippled, whereby the funding aspect is not well covered. Mm-hmm. And it also goes to the other relevant stakeholders like the Civil Protection Unit, where the issue of resources is topical. Mm-hmm. So you find that maybe with the emergence of coronavirus, you find that there's been a talk on the Pandemic National Disaster Fund, which has been on the cards even during the old dispensation. And the current dispensation is also pursuing that, mm-hmm. so that it comes before Parliament. And having that Pandemic National Disaster Fund, mm-hmm. it will then enable Parliament to actually run its affairs properly. And I'm sure that this is something that will also be tabled by His Excellency Comrade Emerson Mnangagwa, mm-hmm. So that we look into it and make it into law so that it becomes operational.
Maybe possibly two quick questions out of that. How are we going to fund that? Do we have budget provision for that? And also, can you highlight the social protection priorities of government in light of the current COVID response?
Thanks, Blessing. I think, in other jurisdictions, you have heard of the sovereign fund, where a nation would actually create its own funding. Mm-hmm. But like any other country, we are still growing as a nation, and we continue to still appeal to the outside world, whether it's bilateral, multilateral players, so that they also come in board. But given the prevailing situation whereby Zimbabwe is under sanctions, resource mobilization has been quite a challenge. And I think given the situation that we have, you find even prioritization of resources in the current pandemic, whereby the minister was taken from other ministries trying to fund, but also having well-wishers, of which I have to thank those well-wishers who have been donating generously to the nation, mm-hmm. is trying to raise the funds. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the prioritization, whereby the budget, currently the health ministry was allocated about 6.5 billion, mm-hmm. and another 1 billion has been channeled by the Minister of Finance to also cater for the emergencies that have come in that regard. And also the social protection nets, whereby stimulus package is trying to address those who have been affected by the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So you see that these are the initiatives, but there is only a possibility of a supplementary budget in other aspects, whereby the minister has to come before Parliament again to seek for more funding. Mm-hmm.
Now, the issue of recurrence is something that needs to be avoided in any disaster. Do we have any lessons that we've learnt from the cyclone Idai? It would not be prudent to leave out the biggest disaster that hit the country in the first quarter of last year. Are there any lessons that came out of that are actually being implemented in the COVID response?
Definitely, Blessing, because if you see the way we were not prepared in terms of this pandemic, I can just cite an example of those beneficiaries of the stimulus package, whereby the social service ministry mm-hmm. has no database which is actually there, and this is also delayed in those beneficiaries getting their dues. So you see now, after the cyclone Idai, I think we were supposed to move with speed so that we then know who is supposed to benefit in the event of any disaster, and how then do we approach those relevant parties. And I think it is very important that going forward as a nation, we need also to come up with that database which has to be holistic, in the sense that they are the MPs who are the representatives of the masses of Zimbabwe. We also have the councillors. I can just say the whole structure, whereby we put up structures, and we know that in the event of a disaster, we've got our SMEs, we've got the vulnerable people, and the administration of the case transfers will not be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a country, do you think that we have adequate guidelines for ethical procurement practice?
Blessing, that has been a debate in a number of circles, but I think we do have, and especially going back to the issue of the new dispensation, whereby the president is preaching the issue of corruption. Yes, others might be saying this institution is captured, but it's not about certain institutions. It's a holistic approach. And I'm glad to say there's also always there coming from the civil society organization. It then entails a holistic approach whereby it's not a one-man band, where each institution, especially the three arms, the executive, the judiciary, and parliament, where we also have to play our part in terms of actually harnessing this menace, which is corruption. And I think culturally as Zimbabweans, we used to have our good qualities in terms of how we approach these ethical issues. But of late, it has been eroded. And I think we also need to go back to the old days where we would treasure and value the issue of doing business in a proper manner.
Now, the parliamentary portfolio committees, what needs to be done also to improve their effectiveness? Have they been effective? You mentioned that there are about 6 of them. Have they been effective in the way that they're rolling out their business?
I can say to a certain extent, Blessing, I cited the issue of resources, which is something that is actually hindered the flow of business at Parliament. But still at the end of the day, it's an ongoing process. And I can say that as Parliament being the watchdog, what we also need to do is to also continue engaging the executive. And you find that real business do happen in these committees, where you then find us in the Augusta House will be trying to grandstand in political grandstanding. But when it comes to Parliament committees, you find that real business has been happening. And it used also to be a taboo to be in such fora like the one that we will be having with the civil society organizations. But I'm glad to say, in particular myself, I've been attending such fora so that you then hear the other side. What are the concerns? What are the citizens saying? And we cannot just disregard the element that the citizens are feeling that we are not doing proper in terms of administering the way we do in terms of corruption. But I can say that with the help of the civil society, in terms of raising awareness to the masses of Zimbabwe, is something that will then eventually come to fruition in terms of harnessing the issues of ethical behaviors.
Honorable Muna, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Blessing. Good day.
Honorable Felix Mona, the chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Budget, Finance and Economic Development. Alois, the issue of action is coming up again. He highlights that we need to implement what we have put on paper. Reporting corruption is one thing. Acting on the report and actually coming up with prosecutions is another. Where are we as Zimbabwe and as Africa?
Thank you so much. I think we haven't done well on that issue. We have very good policies on paper. We have a very good constitution. We have a very good legal framework and policy framework in terms of how to fight corruption. But the challenge, like what Honorable Mona highlighted, is issues around implementation. And we don't just know whether it's lack of political will or it's lack of capacity or inefficiency, we don't know. But the challenge in Zimbabwe, even in Africa as a whole, we are not implementing what is on paper. And as a result, we remain a very vulnerable and miserable state, and corruption continues to then disturb even the growth and development of our nations. So I think there is need for a framework to ensure that recently we did a training session with Parliament on possibly coming up with a monitoring and evaluation framework to ensure that what we develop on paper, we also come up with an M&D framework to ensure that we monitor and evaluate so that we put things into perspective and into action. So that's what's missing in terms of actioning things that we plan.
Honorable Muna is suggesting that we might be making headway in terms of ethical procurement practice. Do you see Zimbabwe coming out with those declarations of public tenders and the other factors that go with ethical procurement practice?
I would say maybe just based on what he has just said, possibly there's something that happening. But the challenge now, if the public is not aware of those processes, then we say we haven't started. The most important thing is to ensure that there's access to information. Is the person down there in Budiriro and Glenview aware of the public procurement processes and how they can then hold government to account on how it is, on how procurement is done? So if that information is not accessible to the public, then there's a challenge. We have always been crying as Transparent International Zimbabwe on issues around beneficial ownership. Who owns the companies that are supplying government goods. Who is benefiting?
It needs to be declared.
Yes, they have to declare. So we need to have, if you look at Section 72 of the Companies and Other Business Entities Act, it actually calls for beneficial ownership register, where the public should be able to access that register to see who is dealing with government. Are they not politically exposed people? There are also chances of conflict of interest. So those things, I think, we still need to work hard to ensure that there's that transparency. Issues around contract transparency. For example, if a person is supplying goods to government, there are also chances of, one, inflating prices. There are chances of also distributing substandard goods. So we need to have issues around contract transparency. The public should have access to contracts that are signed between government and suppliers, so that people can see the terms and conditions, so that they can then be able to hold to account both the suppliers and the government.
Is this happening in Africa, in some African countries?
Yes, in some countries it's happening. I normally give example of South Africa. South Africa has been trying very hard to ensure that there's transparency, even issues around open contracting, issues around even Botswana. If you look even recently, Botswana scored very high in terms of the global corruption perception index. So other African countries are doing very well, but generally as a continent, we haven't done quite well on that one. Because even if you look at some other, we have had instances where even our resources are actually used as what to call it, where the government try to take loans, and also they then say, we will give you these resources, we fail to pay. So we've seen our natural resources, exactly, as collateral, yes. Our natural resources then being used as collateral. So what will happen to the generations to come if we then fail to pay? So there's need for contract transparency on everything that we do, even in the distribution and management of aid in humanitarian crisis.
Are there any common barriers to the anti-corruption fight in light of disasters, especially in the region, and how can we close these?
I think the common barriers that we have seen is, one, issues around cartels. That's a problem in Africa, even maybe beyond. Because the challenge with cartels is that they end up weakening institutions, because they end up controlling those people that are supposed to ensure that there's justice, there's transparency. So I think the issues of cartels, of very few people controlling the government systems and public institutions, that will then derail all efforts to fight corruption. Because even if, for example, a person reports case of corruption, those people then control even the judiciary, and justice will then take place. We've also even seen issues around political will, where the politically exposed people are also controlling even public institutions. The challenge that we have, Blessing, in Africa is that the corrupt people are the heroes, if you look at it. Recently, we had a guy who came out publicly holding some bricks of money. In the eyes of the public, that person is a hero. And up to now, we haven't seen what happened to that person. So if children are seeing that person holding the bricks of money, they see that person as a hero. We have seen several instances where possibly public projects, public projects have been paid for, but the people don't deliver. And those people that take the public resources, they are then also regarded as what? As heroes, because they flash out, very good fashion. They flash out, a lot of things.
So we may be building perceptions, but I understand that man might have been arrested after the RBs had made that call. Calling for...
Possibly, we don't know. But we don't have that information, unfortunately.
And Zimbabwe's effort to fight corruption, especially in disaster, is the civil society enabled to roll out its mandate? Hopo was of the opinion that the CSOs are stifled in carrying out their mandate.
Yeah, I would say, like what I highlighted earlier on, there's that lack of collaboration between government and civil society organizations. The civil society organization, they are very capacitated in terms of finance-wise. We do quite a number of researches. We engage with communities. We know what people want at community level. But there's that lack of trust between the civil society and the government, because sometimes they might then say this is the information that is coming from people, but because of those political barriers, they might fail to accept it. So that's then puts some kind of barriers in the fight against corruption, and also in the capacity of the civil society to deliver on its mandate in the fight against corruption. But let me also say that we are happy, especially as Transparency International, we are actually a step in the right direction. Like what I said, we are now working with Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. We are working with Parliament. Actually, Honorable Mona's committee is one that we work with closely. So we've been training Parliament, we've been working together in terms of even capacity building. So I think, yeah, things are beginning to open up, but I think we still also have a lot of work to do. Yes.
Alois, maybe I can ask you to give your closing sentiments as we head to a close.
Thank you so much. What I would say is that corruption is a cancer that is killing our society. You know, we have quite a number of natural resources. We are rich resource-wise as a nation, but we are still in poverty. So what I'm saying is we are calling upon all the stakeholders, government, everyone, the citizens of Zimbabwe, to ensure that we join hands in the fight against corruption. We are going to have disasters. We had the cyclone Idai. Currently we have the COVID-19. We are going to have disasters. So what do we need to do as a nation? Let's be proactive. Before the disaster, let's come up with policies, mechanisms, let's activate systems and processes to ensure that when disasters happen, our public resources will not be abused by corrupt individuals.
Alois, thank you so much for coming through once again today.
Thank you so much for listening.
Now, as we come to the end of our show, Transparency and Accountability, I would like to thank Alois Nyamazana, Monitoring and Evaluation Officer with the Transparency International Zimbabwe, who was my in-guest studio today. And many thanks to my guests that joined this discussion via telephone, Honorable Felix Mona, who is the Chairperson of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Budget, Finance and Economic Development, and journalist Hopo Chingono. Our discussion today was looking at corruption risks during disaster response, the gaps and opportunities in mitigating risks of corruption related to social protection initiatives as well as humanitarian aid in Zimbabwe. Many thanks, of course, to our partner Transparency International Zimbabwe and all our viewers who followed this discussion through our platforms. Keep in touch with more ZTN programming via our social media platforms on Facebook, Zimpapers TV Network, on Twitter at ZTN News, our Facebook ZTN.co.zw, on YouTube is just ZTN. Now we close with a quote from Transparency International Chair Delia Feria Rubio, who says, open quote, public sector corruption doesn't exist in a vacuum. Foreign bribery and money laundering divert critical resources away from public services and ordinary citizens suffer the most. Close quote. The fight against corruption is definitely our fight. Let's play our part and report corruption. My name is Blessing Munatsi. It has been an absolute pleasure. Stay safe. Good afternoon.